August 1945. President Truman declares that America has harnessed the basic power of the universe, but behind this triumph, a 4-year path of escalating bloodshed led to a weapon designed to end war in a single strike. Pearl Harbor left 2,403 Americans dead. The Tokyo firestorm killed nearly 100,000 civilians in one night. Now, minutes before dawn on a Pacific airstrip, the Enola Gay awaits orders, and the real story of how the world crossed from total war into the atomic age begins. Why did it have to happen this way? Before sunrise on December 7, 1941, a fleet of Japanese aircraft swept over the quiet waters of Pearl Harbor. At 7:55 in the morning, bombs and torpedoes tore through the anchored American battleships and airfields. In less than 2 hours, the attack left 2,403 Americans dead, nearly half of the Pacific Fleet's battleships crippled or sunk, and the nation stunned. The shock was immediate and total. News of the assault raced across the country. Radios crackled with urgent updates, and families gathered in living rooms to listen. Isolationist voices fell silent. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress and the nation. His words, measured and resolute, cut through the grief. He said, "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." In a single sentence, Roosevelt captured the scale of the loss and the sense of betrayal. Congress responded within hours, voting almost unanimously to declare war on Japan. The United States, once hesitant to join the global conflict, now stood united and determined. Across the country, enlistment offices overflowed. Young men lined up in cities and small towns, some waiting through the night to volunteer. Industrial plants shifted overnight from cars and appliances to tanks, planes, and rifles. Shipyards and factories ran around the clock, powered by new workers, men and women drawn from every corner of the country. Enlistment surged. The attack on Pearl Harbor erased any doubt about America's role in the war. Roosevelt's speeches promised not just retribution, but total victory. The nation's vast resources, manpower, and industrial might were now focused on a single goal: defeat the Axis powers. In the months that followed, American production soared. Aircraft factories produced thousands of bombers and fighters. Shipyards launched new vessels at a pace the world had never seen. The psychological pivot was complete. The United States, wounded and outraged, was now fully committed to a war that would demand everything, and would, in time, unleash forces never before imagined. On the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, American Marines advanced inch by inch, their progress measured in yards and bodies. Over 5 weeks, nearly 7,000 Americans died, and more than 20,000 were wounded. Japanese defenders dug into tunnels and bunkers and fought almost to the last man. The island's capture offered a grim preview of what an invasion of Japan's main islands might cost. Okinawa followed. Beginning in April 1945, the battle lasted nearly 3 months. The death toll staggered even hardened commanders, over 12,000 Americans killed and more than 36,000 wounded. For the Japanese, the losses were catastrophic. At least 100,000 soldiers and as many as 100,000 civilians died. Entire families leapt from cliffs or hid in caves, refusing surrender. Kamikaze pilots crashed their planes into American ships, inflicting the highest naval losses of the war. As the ground campaigns raged, the air war escalated. In March 1945, American B-29 bombers unleashed a new weapon on Tokyo, jellied gasoline known as napalm, dropped in canisters to create firestorms. On the night of March 9th, 334 bombers blanketed the city. Winds fanned the flames into a moving wall of fire. In 6 hours, more than 100,000 people died, most burned alive. Wooden homes vanished in minutes. Survivors described the air itself catching fire. The destruction was so complete that pilots reported the smell of burning flesh from 5,000 feet. General Curtis LeMay, the architect behind the campaign, pushed for maximum devastation. His bombers incinerated city after city, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, leaving millions homeless. By summer, conventional air raids had killed nearly 500,000 Japanese civilians. Yet the Japanese government showed no sign of surrender. Instead, military leaders called on civilians to prepare for invasion with bamboo spears. American planners studied the casualty rates from Iwo Jima and Okinawa and applied them to the invasion of the Japanese home islands. The numbers were staggering. Estimates ranged from 100,000 to over 500,000 American dead, and millions of Japanese casualties. Some projections ran even higher. Intelligence reports warned that every city, every village would resist. The shadow of a mainland invasion loomed, a bloodbath on a scale the world had never seen. The result was a sense of strategic deadlock. Conventional bombing had already destroyed much of urban Japan, but failed to break the government's will. The cost of a land invasion looked unbearable. In this atmosphere, the search for a single decisive blow intensified. Behind closed doors, the men responsible for the bombing campaign, engineers, generals, and scientists, began to consider a weapon unlike any used before. The logic was brutal. If fire could not force surrender, perhaps something even more powerful could end the war in a single strike. Secrecy defined every stage of America's atomic effort. In the summer of 1942, General Leslie Groves took command of a project so ambitious that it would reshape entire landscapes. Groves, a career Army engineer, was known for his relentless drive and attention to detail. He moved quickly, assembling a team of scientists and engineers under the direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist with a reputation for brilliance and for seeing the possibilities in the impossible. The Manhattan Project became a shadow nation within a nation. 3 principal sites formed its backbone, each chosen for isolation as much as for utility. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, thousands of workers arrived to find a city built almost overnight. Barbed wire surrounded the compounds, guards checked every badge, and the true purpose of the work was hidden behind layers of code. Oak Ridge's mission was to produce enriched uranium, a process so new that entire factories had to be invented from scratch. At its peak, Oak Ridge consumed more electricity than New York City, yet most employees only knew their own narrow task. Across the continent, the Hanford site in Washington state stretched for miles along the Columbia River. Here, engineers constructed massive reactors to create plutonium, another path to a bomb. The scale was staggering. Concrete poured by the ton, cooling towers rising out of the sagebrush, round-the-clock shifts to keep the reactors running. Hanford's output would eventually fuel the weapon used on Nagasaki, but in 1944 and 1945, its workers toiled in near total isolation, their letters censored and their routines dictated by secrecy. Los Alamos, perched high in the New Mexico desert, became the scientific core. Oppenheimer gathered a constellation of minds, Nobel laureates, young prodigies, and seasoned engineers. They worked behind locked gates, surrounded by armed patrols. The challenge was daunting: turn theory into a weapon, and do it before the war ended. The town itself was erased from maps. Families lived under assumed names. Children attended a school with no address. Even among the scientists, information was compartmentalized. Only a handful understood the full scope of what they were building. By 1945, the Manhattan Project employed more than 130,000 people. The costs soared past $2 billion, an astronomical sum in wartime. Materials arrived by guarded trains, and equipment was stamped with false destinations. Every shipment, every conversation was monitored for leaks. The project's leaders feared not only enemy spies, but also the possibility that a single accident could destroy years of work. Groves demanded progress at a relentless pace. He pushed for parallel development of both uranium and plutonium bombs, refusing to bet the war on a single design. Oppenheimer, meanwhile, managed a team that solved problems at the edge of known science. The pressure was immense. Deadlines loomed, and every setback threatened to undo the entire enterprise. What emerged was not just a bomb, but a new kind of warfare, one built on industrial might, scientific ingenuity, and a level of secrecy unmatched in American history. By the summer of 1945, the United States possessed not just the knowledge, but the physical means to assemble multiple atomic weapons ready for use in combat. The machinery of destruction was now in place, waiting only for the final order. At 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945, a blinding flash cut through the darkness of the New Mexico desert. The Trinity test had begun as theory and calculation, but in that instant, the atomic age became real. The explosion unleashed a force of roughly 20,000 tons of TNT, sending a mushroom cloud 7 miles into the sky. J. Robert Oppenheimer stood among his colleagues, silent as the shockwave rolled over the observation post. Later, he would recall a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Word of the test reached President Harry Truman in Potsdam, Germany, where Allied leaders were mapping out the fate of post-war Europe and Asia. Truman received the coded message, "The baby was born," and understood at once the scale of the new weapon. The numbers from the test, 20 kilotons, a fireball hotter than the sun, glass fused from desert sand, gave him a weapon unlike any in history. Yet the power of the bomb brought with it a question that no one in his position had ever faced before: whether to use it. Inside Washington's war rooms and the halls of the White House, the debate was urgent and deeply divided. The interim committee, led by Secretary of War Henry Stimson and advised by scientists like Oppenheimer and Enrico Fermi, argued for immediate use against Japan. Their recommendation, delivered in June, was blunt: drop the bomb on a war plant surrounded by homes and do so without warning. Only a dramatic, sudden blow, they insisted, could force surrender and save hundreds of thousands of lives that might be lost in a mainland invasion. The committee's minutes record little hesitation. The focus was on ending the war quickly, demonstrating American resolve to the Soviets, and avoiding the risk that a demonstration might fail or give Japan time to prepare. But not all voices agreed. In Chicago, a group of Manhattan Project scientists led by James Frank and Leo Szilard drafted a report warning of the consequences to come. The Frank report, delivered on June 11, 1945, pleaded for a demonstration of the bomb's power before using it on a city. The authors warned that unleashing such destruction without warning would forever stain America's moral standing and trigger a global nuclear arms race. "The success which we have achieved," they wrote, "is fraught with infinitely greater dangers than were all the inventions of the past." They urged that the bomb be detonated on an uninhabited island in full view of international observers as a warning and a chance for diplomacy. Truman weighed the arguments as casualty estimates from Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, landed on his desk. Some forecasts reached 500,000 American dead, with millions more Japanese casualties. The memory of Okinawa and Iwo Jima was fresh. Entire cities burned, defenders fighting to the last, civilians leaping from cliffs. The scale of projected loss was almost too large to grasp. On July 25, 1945, Truman recorded his decision in his diary. "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. It seems to be the most terrible thing ever discovered, but it can be made the means of destruction of civilization." Yet he gave the order. The bomb would be used against Japan, with the first target selected for its military value and psychological effect. No advance warning would be given. The Potsdam Declaration followed on July 26, 1945. Truman, joined by Churchill and Chiang Kai-shek, called on Japan to surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government's reply, mokusatsu, was ambiguous, interpreted by Allied leaders as a refusal. The Trinity test had proven the weapon. The policy debate ended with a single order. The point of no return had been crossed. The machinery of war now turned toward Hiroshima. The bomb arrived at Tinian in heavy crates, watched over by armed guards and a handful of engineers who knew its true purpose. In a sweltering Quonset hut, technicians began the careful work of assembling Little Boy. The bomb's outer casing, 10 feet long, olive drab, blunt-nosed, waited as components arrived in stages, each under strict escort. Inside the bomb bay of the Enola Gay, the assembly was both routine and unprecedented. Captain William Deke Parsons, the Navy's chief ordnance officer, led the process. Parsons had rehearsed every step, but the reality was unforgiving. Cramped space, tropical heat, and the knowledge that one mistake could destroy the plane and crew before they ever left the ground. Alongside Parsons worked Lieutenant Morris Jepson, a young physicist tasked with handling the bomb's electrical systems. The two men moved along a narrow catwalk, tools in hand, guided by a strict checklist. The uranium projectile, a hollow cylinder weighing nearly 40 kilograms, was loaded into the gun barrel, followed by the solid target insert. Each piece fit with the precision of a watch, but the bomb's heart remained incomplete. The powder charge, 4 silk bags of cordite, would only be inserted later, just before takeoff, to minimize the risk of accidental detonation. Wrenches turned in the dim light as Parsons and Jepson worked through the night. The bomb's firing circuit was kept safe by 3 green plugs, each one a barrier against disaster. Red plugs, marked for combat, waited in a small pouch, ready for the final switch in flight. Every connection, every bolt, was checked twice, then sealed. The bomb's electrical systems were tested, then disconnected from the plane's power, leaving only the internal battery to stand ready. By dawn, the assembly was complete. The bomb's casing was bolted shut, its seams painted over to hide the work inside. Only Parsons and Jepson knew how close the line was between safety and catastrophe. For now, Little Boy was secure, sealed, silent, and waiting for the last steps that would make it ready to fire. The briefing room on Tinian was stifling even before midnight. Colonel Paul Tibbets stood at the front, his voice steady as he read through the mission orders. Around him, the Enola Gay's 12-man crew listened in silence. Each man received his own checklist, navigation, bomb release, radio codes, and emergency procedures. The room felt suspended between routine and something no one could name. Tibbets reminded them of the risks: a crash on takeoff, a malfunction in flight, the chance of capture if the mission failed. There was no bravado, just a careful accounting of what could go wrong. On a small table, the flight surgeon set out a box of cyanide capsules. Each crew member took one, tucking the glass vial into a breast pocket or flight kit. The instructions were clear: if shot down over enemy territory, capture was not an option. No one spoke as the vials changed hands. At 1:50 in the morning, the crew filed out to the runway. The Enola Gay waited under floodlights, its aluminum skin gleaming in the humid air. Tibbets walked the length of the plane, pausing at each engine, running his hand along the fuselage. Parsons and Jepson, still carrying the weight of the bomb's final assembly, checked the bomb bay one last time. Farabee, the bombardier, reviewed his sighting charts while Van Kirk, the navigator, plotted the route to Hiroshima again and again. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was tight but disciplined. Tibbets ran through the pre-flight ritual: fuel gauges, hydraulic lines, oxygen masks. Each system was checked, logged, and signed off. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, but the quiet was different tonight. Parsons clipped his checklist to the wall and glanced at the clock, 2:10 in the morning. Engines coughed, then roared to life. The vibration rattled the controls, shaking loose the last traces of calm. Tibbets called for taxi at 2:25. The Enola Gay rolled slowly to the end of the runway, lights winking in the darkness. In the minutes before takeoff, there was only the thrum of engines and the knowledge that, once airborne, there would be no turning back. At 8:09, Enola Gay turned onto its final approach. The city of Hiroshima stretched below, the Aioi Bridge standing out as the aiming point. Inside the cockpit, Colonel Paul Tibbets steadied the controls, holding the B-29 level at 31,000 feet. Navigator Theodore Van Kirk watched his charts, checking bearings and crosswinds, every calculation precise. Beside him, Bombardier Thomas Farabee peered through the Norden bomb site, tracking the city's grid as it drifted beneath the glass. The bomb bay doors opened with a metallic whine. The crew's voices dropped to a whisper, each man focused on his task. Farabee called out the final corrections, hands steady on the bomb site. The seconds ticked down. Tibbets kept the plane on course, every vibration of the engines magnified by the tension in the cabin. At 8:14 and 17 seconds, Farabee began the 60-second bombing sequence. The Aioi Bridge slid into the crosshairs. Farabee squeezed the trigger, holding it as the bomb site's mechanism adjusted for speed, altitude, and wind. The city below seemed frozen in the morning haze. At 8:15 and 16 seconds, Farabee's voice cut through the intercom. Bomb away. Little Boy dropped from the bay, vanishing toward the earth. In the cockpit, Tibbets pushed the control column hard right and down. The Enola Gay banked sharply, engines straining as the plane dove away at full throttle. The escape maneuver had been rehearsed in training, but never with stakes like these. every second counted. The bomb would take 43 seconds to fall. The crew braced for the unknown. Parsons and Jepson, seated behind the cockpit, listened for the sequence of clicks and relays that would arm the bomb as it fell. The green safety plugs, swapped for red just minutes before, meant there was no turning back. In those moments, the air inside the B-29 was thick with anticipation, but the crew moved by habit. Van Kirk called out the course for the getaway run. Ferriby watched the bomb site's numbers spin away from the target. Tibbets kept the plane low and fast, racing to put distance between the Enola Gay and the blast that none of them could fully imagine. Below, Little Boy tumbled through clear sky, barometric sensors and radar altimeters counting down to detonation. The crew waited in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon, hands gripping controls and checklists. 43 seconds. No one spoke. The only sounds were the engines and the ticking of watches. In that gap between release and impact, the world held its breath. At 8:16 in the morning, a point of invisible calculation became a point of no return. Little Boy detonated at precisely 1,968 feet above Hiroshima, almost directly above the Shima Surgical Clinic. In that fraction of a second, the physics of the bomb met the reality of a living city. The fireball reached a temperature of more than 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the surface of the sun. At the center, steel vaporized, concrete turned to powder, and human bodies simply disappeared. Within a radius of half a mile, everything living was erased. The blast wave raced outward at over 1,000 feet per second, flattening wooden houses, shattering glass, and hurling debris through the air like shrapnel. On the street below, a city bus was lifted off its wheels and thrown into the river. Streetcars caught mid-commute became tombs for their passengers. A pocket watch found in the ruins stopped at the instant of detonation at 8:15. At the Shima Clinic, doctors and patients vanished in an instant. The building's shadow burned into the pavement, leaving a ghostly outline where walls once stood. In the streets, people walking to work or school were caught by a flash so intense that clothing ignited and skin blistered before the sound ever reached them. Survivors later described a white light, then darkness, then a wind so violent it stripped the bark from trees and tore tiles from roofs. Some remembered statues melting, or the feeling of being lifted and thrown by an invisible hand. 3/4 of a mile from the center, the shockwave shattered windows and collapsed ceilings. Fires erupted everywhere. Tatami mats burst into flame, paper screens disintegrated, and wooden beams burned where they stood. The air itself seemed to catch fire. In the Eba district, children on their way to school were thrown to the ground, many blinded or burned by the flash. One survivor later recalled everything going white, then being lifted and flying through the air. When they woke, their clothes were gone, and their skin hung from their arms. The heat and pressure fused roof tiles, melted glass bottles, and left shadows etched onto stone steps, dark reminders of those who had been sitting there only moments before. Black rain began to fall within minutes, heavy with radioactive ash and dust. It soaked survivors as they staggered through the ruins, searching for family, calling out in voices already hoarse from smoke and fear. In the space of 3 minutes, Hiroshima was transformed from a city of morning routines into a landscape of silence and flame. The technical precision of the airburst, calculated to maximize destruction, had found its mark. On the ground, the logic of war gave way to chaos. Doctors without hospitals, families without homes, survivors without words for what had just happened. In the hours after the blast, Hiroshima became a city of shadows and silence. Survivors wandered through ruins, their skin burned and clothing in tatters, searching for water or loved ones who would never answer. The firestorm raged for hours, consuming what the explosion had spared. Hospitals that still stood filled with the wounded, but doctors and nurses, many themselves injured, could only offer what little aid remained. By nightfall, a new and unfamiliar sickness began to spread. People who had survived the blast without visible wounds grew weak, their hair falling out in clumps, gums bleeding, fevers rising. Some died within days, others lingered for weeks, their bodies failing from causes no one understood. In the first 4 months, between 90,000 and 166,000 people, men, women, and children, were dead, most of them civilians. News of Hiroshima's destruction traveled quickly, but the full scale of the catastrophe was obscured by confusion and censorship. Japanese leaders received only fragments, a city wiped out in a single instant, a weapon beyond comprehension. Even as the government struggled to assess what had happened, another blow struck. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and sent its armies sweeping into Manchuria. The prospect of invasion from two directions, American and Soviet, shattered any remaining hope among Japan's war planners for a negotiated end on favorable terms. Inside the Imperial Palace, the Supreme War Council met in near-constant session. The army's senior leaders argued for continued resistance, convinced that one more battle might yield better surrender terms or even a negotiated peace. Others, including Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, warned that further delay would only bring more devastation. The atomic bomb's destruction, combined with the Soviet offensive, left little doubt about Japan's prospects. Emperor Hirohito, rarely involved directly in military decisions, now faced a choice that would define his reign. On August 14th, after days of deadlock, he summoned his ministers and declared his wish to end the war. In a voice few had ever heard, Hirohito spoke of enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. He ordered an immediate acceptance of the Allies' terms, including the unprecedented surrender of the Japanese nation. That night, as the emperor's recorded message was prepared for broadcast, a group of army officers attempted a coup. They stormed the palace, searching for the record to destroy it and prevent surrender. Loyal guards hid the disc and protected Hirohito. By dawn, the coup had failed. On August 15, 1945, the emperor's voice reached his people for the first time. His words, formal and indirect, spoke of a new and most cruel bomb and the need to bring peace to the world. Across Japan, millions listened in stunned silence. The war that had consumed a generation was over. In Hiroshima, the survivors Hibakusha faced a future forever changed by radiation and loss. The city's ruins stood as a warning and a question, one that would echo across the world for decades to come. Nuclear arsenals still number over 12,000 warheads worldwide. Each carries power far beyond that first detonation. As global tensions shift and technology races ahead, the shadow of Hiroshima continues to challenge our sense of safety and responsibility. The legacy is not just what was unleashed, but the ongoing question: will humanity ever choose restraint over ruin? Let me know how this history shapes your view. Share your thoughts below.